Hello my friends, Dr. M is here with you again to support your journey with principles of economics. And with previous discussion we talked about money, how it enters into our macroeconomic analysis as it relates to establishing relationship graphically and functionally between gross domestic product, unemployment, and price level. In specific terms, in lieu of review, we looked at calculation of money demand that was based on nominal GDP, hypothetically equated to $1 trillion in the United States, and hypothetically chosen interest rate in nominal terms equated to 4%, and cash balance ratio at 0.1%. So money demand in this case turned out to be $100 billion. And now we can calculate in a similar way if our gross domestic product in nominal terms goes up to $1.2 trillion, then your money demand adjusted accordingly $120 billion. At that point, my friends, you should already be comfortable with the idea that demand for money and output are intrinsically related. Specifically, let me drive this point home. Money is an interesting commodity only in terms of the derivative, which means that people are not interested in money. People are interested in goods and services that the money can buy. So money chasing goods and services, and thus there should be a balance between how much money you have, this medium of account and medium of exchange, chasing goods and services. For instance, if you have too much money available and relatively fewer goods and services, then you end up in disequilibrium where there is a deficit of goods and services. And oftentimes you can find such deficit in some South American countries. You can also find such deficits of goods and services in North Korea, in Belarus, in Cuba, and some other countries, or Venezuela, for instance, where basically people have lots of money on their hands but fewer goods and services. So, and that in essence triggers hyperinflation. Where you find hyperinflation, you will likely end up having money, lots of money, chasing relatively fewer goods and services. Now, on the other hand, you can have more goods and services but relatively fewer money available. And that creates a very different phenomena. In particular, you will have lots of goods and services available at the marketplace, such as when you go to the car dealership, for example. You always find some cars that are waiting for their buyers, and there is excess of those cars. There are lots of cars in the lot waiting for their buyers, and that is indicating that there are more goods and services and relatively less money chasing those available goods and services. Now, let's look at something else. Ideally, you don't want to consider money demanded as a standalone, separate, independent entity. Although it is helpful to understand that the money demand depends upon cash balance ratio K and nominal GDP. But realistically, we also want to consider the money supply. And as we have already explicitly introduced, that the only source that could generate, print more money is the central bank. In the United States, it's the Federal Reserve, and in Europe, it's the Central Bank of Europe. So then you have this equilibrium between the money demand and money supply. And such equilibrium can be illustrated just like any other graphical presentation when you have quantity on the right hand side and price on the left hand side. So you have supply of money and you have demand of money. So let's be consistent with our notation. You have money supply and you have money demand, and quantity is standing for how much money is out there, and price for money, as we have already determined, is nominal interest rate. Nominal interest rate. All right, so in this case, you already have the equilibrium where nominal interest rate is going to be established based on equilibrium demand and supply of money. So this equilibrium must hold, and in essence, my friends, that's what determines the market interest rate. So I want you to understand, because there's a lot of confusion among people. Some people think that this nominal interest rate is actually determined by central bank. No, the nominal interest rate in capitalist economy is determined by the market forces. And the only thing that the Federal Reserve does, or any central bank, is changing the borrowing interest rate at which banks can borrow money from the central bank. Because banks serve the public and they have to get the money source from somewhere. And that, given that exclusive role of central bank is to print the money, that's where banks, individual banks, go to get the money. All right, so now we can move on and do some comparative static analysis. So we just discussed and covered the equilibrium where money demand must be equal to money supply, and that's how graphically on the previous slide on my notepad it looks like. So the next thing is to do some algebra, because I'm moving closer and closer by establishing the relationship between money, output, unemployment, and price level. And that will give us a fuller picture, or a more complete picture of macroeconomics. So from the beginning of this presentation, you know that the money demand is a function of cash balance ratio and nominal GDP. And what I'm going to do, I will express nominal GDP from that simple algebraic manipulation as a function of money demand divided by the cash balance ratio. But recall from the previous discussions, when we started macroeconomics discussion, we also determined that the nominal GDP was a function of price times quantity. Price is a price level. We know how to calculate the price level to understand whether you have positive change in price level, meaning inflation, or negative change in price level, meaning deflation. And thus, we also have realistically quantity, which is the real GDP, and that is determined by tastes and technology. So what I want to do next, I will equate those two And the way to reconcile them is through the common denominator, which is m. So I'm going to express price in terms of m divided by k times quantity. And in this case, m is solely again determined by the Federal Reserve, and quantity is determined by the taste and technology, and we already know k is determined by interest rates and technology of payment. We are moving closer and closer now how we can determine the relationship between price and price level at the marketplace and the money equilibrium that evolves at the marketplace. So before we move on, I wanted to reiterate that one reason why your pizza purchase may cost you $10 per pizza is because it is derived by the quantity. It depends how many pizzas out there chasing available cash. So Q as a quantity is basically determines how much stuff, how many goods and services out there. When you have lots of stuff, when companies produce lots of Q, then things become inexpensive in relative terms. So what does that mean? That means if you look carefully at this formula, let me go to the notepad and be more specific. If you look more carefully at the formula that we just derived, that price is the function of money divided by cash balance ratio times quantity, please note that there is inverse relationship between quantity and price level. That's exactly what it implies. When companies increase their production, they increase the quantity, they increase how much stuff is going to be out there, then the price level must go down due to the inverse relationship between those two variables. So that's important because this relationship will be helpful for us to understand what happens when quantity or GDP in real terms is changing over time. You can predict and explain what happens to the price level. Now, you can think about the change in quantity not only in terms of changing the rate of production by individual firms, but also change in population. For example, some countries in Eastern Europe experience decrease in population. Decrease in population may come through a variety of reasons. It could be immigration. Some talented people just leave the country for better opportunities in economic terms overseas. It could be a plug, maybe a virus, or something that makes population decline. Now, that would in itself impact upon how much Q is in the economy, how many goods and services available for consumption. So, and that's something that you want to keep in mind as you do your analysis. All right, now we can move on and we can come to a closer conclusion by asking this question: how long do I hold the money before spending it? That is a very fascinating question because essentially the answer to that question will depend upon the action of the Fed as it relates to the benefits and cost of holding money. When people hold on to money, they essentially impact cash balance ratio, in such a way where holding on to money long implies that K goes up, and thus will reduce the spending and thus reduce the price level. Look at our definition when it comes to K. I just gave you example what happens when we have change in output. Now I just gave you example also what happens to the fact when K goes up, it will push the price level to go down because there is also inverse relationship between the two. So in the same way, if people decide not devoting too much when it comes to holding money, then K goes down and spending becomes excessive and the price level increases accordingly. Now we can jump to talk about what happens to M, money in itself. How much money is out there? Let's go to the notepad because I want you to see that we are moving in a very orderly fashion. We just talk about the quantity and how it impacts the price level. We also talk about K, cash balance ratio, and how it impacts the price level. Both of them have inverse relationship, and thus whenever K goes up, price goes down. Whenever quantity goes up, the price level goes down as well. Now, one thing that is left to discuss, what happens to the money. When money is increasing, price level goes up because there is a proportional relationship between the two. Let's go back to our slide. So how much money is out there charging goods and services? That's the real question that will help us to understand the relationship between prices and the money. A lot of money, as I stated before, leads to high demand for goods and services. Because when people have access in cash, they want to buy goods and services. They are not interested in holding money paper because people are interested in goods and services, not in money in itself. Money just is a derivative, so to speak. So in this case, we can also conclude that not much money out there leads to lower price level, and historically the price level has a very direct proportional relationship to how much money is out there. Now you see that when the central bank decides to print money, how important it is when it comes to impact upon the price level that we observe at the marketplace. And essentially it allows you to think through what happens to inflation or deflation when the central bank decides to print more money or less money. It has certainly influenced this relationship. So now let me just give you an example how this dynamic plays out. I'm going to suppose that the money initially at level M sub 0. then the value of price level will be accordingly documented as P sub 0. Now suppose we double the money supply. The central bank decides to print more money for whatever reason, however they want to justify. In many African countries, government wants central bank to print more money simply because it generates revenue. And in some countries, printing money can generate historically up to even 20% or 30% of the government revenue. In the United States, it's approximately maybe 2% of GDP. Now, holding other things constant, when you double the money supply, you are essentially arriving to the new level, M sub 1, because you just printed more money and you have resulted a different amount of money. Then look what happens to the price level. The price level is going to double as well. So here's your conclusion. Doubling the money supply will necessarily cause the price level to approximately double as well. It has been done across all countries. It has been documented throughout the history across all countries. It was done in Germany, it has been done in Brazil, Argentina, Russia, Lithuania, and many other countries. So this relationship is quite well studied and documented. And finally, I want us to bring this discussion to conclusion and express this relationship between the price level, money, cash balance ratio, and output in the growth terms. We already know that for small changes, that will hold approximately the same, and we will treat it as exactly true as it was presented to you in previous presentations. Specifically, what you will see in front of you, that the growth rate of the price level is equal to the growth rate of the money, the growth rate of cash balance ratio, and growth rate of the output. Notice the signs. There is a negative relationship between growth rate of price level, cash balance ratio, and output, and there's a positive relationship between growth rate between price level and growth rate of money. Historically, in the United States, growth rate of output has been around 3%, growth rate of cash balance ratio approximately around 0. It depends on technology and preferences of payments. And then you are ending up that the chief influencing factor is how much money growing in the economy, which is essentially ending up changing the price level. Thank you, my friends, for your attention, and we'll see you soon.